the question is really, is this just soap opera tittle tattle, but just of the posh kind? And in which case, is it just sort of fun to watch? Or does it have any significance? Do allegations of racism against a member of the royal family, one assumes a fairly senior member of the royal family, do they damage not just the royal family, but do they damage Britain's reputation as well? And what is going to come of this? And does this raise questions about the monarchy itself, especially after Prince Harry talked about how he was trapped and how his brother William and his father, the heir to the throne, are also trapped in this organisation? We'll be talking about all of this throughout the show, including talking about kids going back to school and indeed NHS backlogs, and why these amazing sets of COVID data we're getting at the moment aren't leading us to coming out of lockdown sooner. Well, we'll talk about that with Benjamin Butterworth, who's late editor at the iPaper. We'll get his thoughts on my next guest and what he has to say as well. First guest in this hour is Norman Baker. He's a former Liberal Democrat MP. He's also author of the brilliant book, And What Do You Do? What the Royal Family Don't Want You to Know, all about the royal finances. Good morning to you, Norman.
Morning, Julia.
Morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, some aspects of this interview have been, been bigger than others. Of course, the aspects of the racism and the like. But you, having written a book about the royal finances, no doubt would have been particularly intrigued by what Prince Harry had to say about how he'd been literally cut off by Prince Charles. It was one of the claims he made, and financially, and that was why they moved to California. They were, $100 million deal with Netflix. This deal with Spotify. They're doing interviews like this because they need to pay for security, and his security. He knew that his son would not be eligible for security, and he needed to make sure that he and his wife and their children and unborn child were safe. What do you make of those claims?
Well, like you, I found the whole film quite riveting. And the one piece where I thought Harry and Meghan didn't come across as convincing was in relation to the point you just raised. Because if you're not in the royal family as a leading member, then I don't see why you should be able to draw on the public purse for security. I think you and I have disagreed on that point before, but we don't give public money to protect, say, David Beckham's children. So why should we pay money to protect somebody who's not an acting member of the royal family and has distanced themselves from it? So I don't have much sympathy with that point, and he has got sufficient private resources to pay for security himself.
And that's the thing he does, doesn't he? When he says he was cut off, again, he talks about being cut off in his mid-30s by his parents. I think lots of people would be delighted to get to their mid-30s still being supported financially by their parents. But he did inherit, didn't he, when his mother died, £7.5 million. And if that had been invested well, which one assumes it should have been, that should be worth, well over 20 million by now. And he also was getting 2.3 million from Prince Charles. Now we're told, well, that's Prince Charles's private estate from Duchy of Cornwall, but of course, again, he doesn't pay the same taxes, doesn't pay corporation tax and the like on that income. But he's funding the family. Of course, he's got an army pension of £35,000 as well. Most people would probably think they'd manage to get by on those sorts of sums.
I think they would get by, and the idea that you're still supporting your children when they're 35 is just reflecting on the fact my daughter's 20. I don't know if she's going to be expecting me to support her when she's 35. I hope not. But look, that was the weakest point of their argument, and it came across as self-serving, because they have got plenty of money, and they've got Netflix deals bringing in loads of money. They don't need support from the public person. You've got to turn this round. Had they had support from the public person, the argument would have been from people like me, why are we supporting these people who are not active members of the royal family living in California from the public person when we should be spending on the health service or the education system? So I think, in a sense, you were right to be cut off, if that's the phrase he wants to use, a rather pejorative phrase, but I think that was the right decision for the palace. I have to say, it's the only thing in the programme where the palace came out with any credibility, to my mind.
That's interesting. What did you make also of these claims about racism in the royal family? You've dug around, not just in the finances, but in the royal family generally. We haven't had a Buckingham Palace response so far. We've had Joe Biden, the American president, praising Meghan's courage, but we've had Boris Johnson saying he doesn't want, at the press conference last night, we don't want to get drawn into any of this, but with fulsome praise for the Queen and her role in our country. But It was interesting what Meghan was claiming about Archie, their son, and how he wasn't a prince, and that he would not, under the change in the law which was brought about under George V, about 100 years ago now, that basically, unless you were directly in line to the throne, the great grandchildren of the king or queen don't become princes, but that once, say, Prince Charles becomes the king, then her child would be a grandchild, not a great grandchild of the king, and therefore would become a prince. And they were changing the rules, and she said, well, they're changing the rules around the time that my son is unborn, and they don't know what colour skin he's going to have, and the implication of that is that this is all racism. Do you think it's racism, or do you think this was just part of the whole plan which Prince Charles had about sort of narrowing down and slimming down the royal family to a rather more meagre size?
Well, on that latter point, I think it was just a coincidence in a sense. I mean, look, there are far too many members of the royal family. If you look at the Benelux countries or Scandinavian countries, they manage on about 4 or 5 members of the royal family, and we seem to have numerous numbers. I mean, on the front page of my book, it's got 44 of them on the balcony. What are they all doing? So I don't believe it's appropriate for everybody to be a prince or a princess just because they're related to someone who might be king or queen at some particular point. However, on the question of racism, I think that's a more serious issue. And in my book, and one of the chapters, We Are Not Amused, provides a litany of examples of racist comments from senior members of the royal family over the decades, which continue to this day, actually. So I have to say, if you look at the Queen's employees, of 900 employees in the 1990s, only 10 of them were ethnic minorities. And it wasn't until 2017, 64 years into her reign, that anyone from an ethnic minority was given anything like a senior position in the palace. So I'm afraid these allegations do have some validity to them. And the palace's reaction has always been, the royal family's reaction has always been, we demand support and respect. We don't have to earn it. Well, I'm sorry, they do have to earn it.
What you said, I mean, in terms of racism at high levels of the royal family, how much of that can be put down to people of a certain generation, not excusing it ever in any scenario,
Yeah.
but the idea that the language that, say, my grandmother would have used when she was alive about, say, black people or Indian people or Pakistani people would have been different to the language that that my parents were raised to use, that I was raised to use, and that my child is going to be raised to use. There have been massive generational differences. And so a lot of the phrases, for instance, that say my grandparents' generation would have been considered to be the polite, respectful language you would have used about people of colour, would now be considered to be racist language, but they wouldn't have intended it in that way. There's a difference between people having sort of hatred and prejudice in their hearts, and people using language or indeed, and we have this with the whole sort of rewriting of our history of our country, that accepting the fact that we are a much less racist society today than we were 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years, and the views that they may have expressed at that time may have actually been quite typical views for people of that generation in that year.
Well, I've got some sympathy with that, Julia, and it's certainly true that attitudes have changed for the benefit and for the good, actually, over 20, 30, 40 years. However, some of the language which has been used by the royal family has been quite sharp and acidic. I mean, the quote I just gave you about the President of Guyana was not the attitude of most people 40 years ago. It was actually quite violent, actually. And it's very different, actually, from Prince Philip's utterances, which are out of place nowadays, but actually were in some ways regarded as harmless back then. So there's a difference between those two. So yes, we have to allow for the generational change. And I hope very much that the younger generation of the royals doesn't share those views. But of course, they've been brought up in that atmosphere. So some of that must have rubbed off. To be fair, I've never heard an example of the Queen being alleged to have made a racist comment, and nor have I heard allegations against, say, Prince William. So perhaps this is now dying out, but the monarchy is an extremely ultra small c conservative institution, and it's behind the times. It's behind where Britain is. So it should represent the nation as a whole and bring people together, but it's actually steeped in the past. And there's now a challenge for the royal family, and for Prince Charles in particular. Are they going to defend this, or are they going to use it as an opportunity to move on and to grab this and say, okay, let's deal with this issue and reform ourselves?
Well, I mean,
Hartley
this is it in terms of whether they can. How damaging do you think these allegations are? The finger being pointed. We don't know exactly what was said about Prince Archie. So Prince Archie, Archie's not Prince, as we've established. We don't know exactly what was said about him and whether it was a question which a lot of families would ask, whether or not there was someone of a different ethnic group who was having a child or not. But just say, I wonder what our kid's going to look like. I wonder who it's going to take after. Will it be an amalgamation of the two? Will it have blonde hair, ginger hair? Will it be black, mixed race, white? Those you can ask those questions and it not be remotely racist, but there's also a way of expressing, if you don't, well, I hope your baby's not black, that's clearly racist. I mean,
you're right. I mean, you can express it in a neutral way, but the implication given by Harry and Meghan, we haven't got their side of the story, of course. The implication given by them was it was not neutral, and it was designed to provide the concern from somebody in the royal family that the darker the skin, the less acceptable it was. That was the impression which they gave. Now, I suspect that's probably true. I have to say it's unhelpful to make the allegation not say who it is, because it now means every single member of the royal family has been tainted with that. And until we know who it is, suspicion will land on everybody apart from the scene.
Just finally, do you think that this is going to damage? I think for some people it makes Meghan and Harry look like victims. For other people, it's making them look very bad. The polling seems to suggest that's very much a generational split. But do you think overall this is going to damage the institution, not just the individuals in the royal family, the institution of the monarchy?
Yes, well, it's a plague on both their houses. I think in a civil war, we know there's some political parties. No side comes out winning. Both sides will lose from this, as a matter of fact. It will damage the monarchy, but as I said in my book, there are many, many aspects of the royal family and the monarchy which are deeply unacceptable, not least of all the financial matters. And the more that comes out, the more unacceptable it is. So they need to reform themselves. They need to reform themselves before the public reforms them for them.